Have you ever imagined how a single moment can forever change the fate of two lives that should never cross? In the suffocating silence of the Duke's mansion, a paralyzed heir lived isolated from the world until a young slave girl, lost in the forbidden corridors, opens the door she should never touch. From then on, every look, every whispered word becomes a risk and a calling impossible to ignore. Stay here, because what you're about to hear will touch your heart in a way you've perhaps never felt before. So tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to hear how far my voice reaches. Charleston, 1854. The humid air carried the salty smell of the harbor and the sweet perfume of magnolias, while horse-drawn carriages creaked along the cobblestone streets and gas lamps lit one by one the end of the day. High on a hill, dominating the skyline like a verdict, stood the Whitmore Mansion, a neoclassical facade with impeccable white columns, wide carved wood balconies, cast iron, railings and tall perpetually polished windows. The marble floor of the foyer reflected the golden light and the hurried footsteps of servants, coordinated by bells that tinkled from room to room. In the music room, a piano imported from Boston awaited distinguished guests. In the library, leather spines exuded a subtle scent of antique paper and varnish. Everything there proclaimed wealth and control. Heavy velvet drapes pulled at just the right angle, fine china aligned without a millimeter of error, grandfather clocks marking the cadence of a house that tolerated no delays, hesitations, or questions. Yet, amid the symmetry of the halls and the glow of the chandeliers, there was an asymmetry no one dared challenge. At the far end of the east wing, past a corridor cooler than the rest of the house, where the floor wax seemed to lack the same shine and the air held a lingering scent of lamp oil, there was a door. Not just any door, dark, antique wood, reinforced by discreet hardware, a heavy lock whose creaking mechanism had been heard by few. Around it, the silence was not simply an absence of sound, but a kind of surveillance. The carpet here lacked the same lush pattern as the others. It was thicker, as if chosen to muffle footsteps. The nearby windows kept their blinds half closed, so that the hallway lived in an artificial twilight, even at noon. The servants knew enough not to make a mistake. This was Whitmore's invisible boundary. There were express orders from the master of the house, Duke Charles Whitmore, repeated without alteration by the housekeeper, Mrs. Parker, every time a newcomer signed the guest book. No one enters. No one touches the doorknob. No one asks. The keys to that side of the mansion were kept in a short, silent bunch, kept in the Duke's jacket pocket or in the housekeeper's metal clasp, and only changed hands when one of them was present. It wasn't an absolute secret. A few saw trays come and go at odd hours. The doctor appear twice a week. A particular servant polished the doorknob without ever turning it, but it was a governed secret, protected by authority and fear. Rumors circulated like air currents. Some swore they had heard, on certain nights, the muffled sound of wheels slowly moving across the floorboards. Others claimed to have seen a sliver of light escape from under the door and suddenly extinguish like a suppressed sigh. The older generation, who had already buried too many secrets, only lowered their eyes when the subject touched on that part of the house. Discipline there wasn't just about chores, it was about omissions. Every tray left on the doorstep, every measured step, every conversation cut short contributed to an atmosphere in which the mansion's brilliant routine coexisted with a permanent shadow. And this shadow didn't come from the gardens at dusk. It came from within, as if the very heart of the house had been moved behind that door and beat there rhythmically under imposed conditions, constantly reminding everyone that certain truths existed but could not be seen. If this story already captivated you in the first part alone, imagine what's yet to come. Sign up now and follow every revelation in this plot that blends mystery, romance, and decisions capable of changing destinies forever. Sarah Johnson was 23 when the auctioneer in the Charleston courthouse yard banged the gavel and wrote her name on a yellowed bill of sale. The morning smelled of salt and sweat. Men examined teeth, hands, backs. Women clutched children to their chests. A coachman drove her in a covered wagon to the back of Whitmore Mansion, where kitchen smoke marked the air like a clock. There the day began before the sun. They welcomed her without ceremony. They removed her worn handkerchief, examined her calloused palms, measured her pace. The housekeeper, Mrs. Parker, short and stern, spoke without raising her voice. You will wake before 4, light the brazier, grind the coffee, stir the corn in the iron kettle, clean fish when there is any, pluck chickens on the appointed dates, climb the service stairs with trays without making a sound. Eyes on the ground, shoulders back, short answers. There is no room for distraction here. The kitchen was a world apart. Sooty walls, iron pots lined up like soldiers, a wooden mortar worn to a perfect concavity, knives sharpened to the rhythm of the day. The oldest cook, Aunt Ruth, guided everything with a gaze that saw before any mistake. Beside her, Elijah, the butler, polished silverware with soft cloths. Mercy, a girl with fine braids, learned to wash dishes in near-boiling water, her fingers always red. Sarah caught the rhythm of the place by observing breathing, the hiss of steam, the crackle of logs, the sizzle of grease. That afternoon, when she carried the first tub of hot water down the back hallway, she felt the house change. The cool marble underfoot, the verbena-scented air drifting from the halls, the tinkling of bells calling for service. It was in this passage between the smell of cornmeal and the brightness of the rooms that the warnings arrived. Aunt Ruth didn't stop stirring the spoon, but her voice was firm. "Girl, memorize the map of this house. The service stairs go up that way. The sideboard is before the dining room, the pantry is after the short hallway, and there's the east hallway. You don't go that way." Elijah, without looking up from the cloth, added, "Never go to the east hallway. There lies the family secret." Sarah felt the weight of the phrase. It wasn't superstition, it was a rule, and rules had teeth. In the following days, Mrs. Parker repeated the permitted itinerary, like someone drawing boundaries, from the kitchen to the pantry, from the pantry to the sideboard, from the sideboard to the dining room, always via the narrow staircase that avoided the main hall. The east corridor was not on any route, yet its existence was palpable. The air changed as one passed near it. The blinds there kept the light dim. Every now and then a tray was left on the floor and removed empty later, without announcement, without conversation. The family doctor appeared twice a week, impeccably dressed, and disappeared in that direction, leaving behind the clean smell of alcohol and leather. No one pretended to ignore him. They simply obeyed. Sarah learned to breathe at the imposed rhythm. Short steps, firm spine, balanced tray, with each coming and going, small. Invisible maps were fixed. A creaky step, a higher threshold, a corner where the wind penetrated. And beneath it all, the feeling that the house had a sealed-off center, a heart guarded by keys and gazes. When, one night, a sudden crack of thunder momentarily extinguished the flames in the brazier, and the kitchen plunged into darkness, she heard in the distance the discreet sound of wheels rolling over wood. It was brief, almost silent, but it was enough to understand why the warnings came. Without blinking, in that mansion work was work, and limits, destiny. Will Sarah obey? What do you think? Comment yes or no. The wind blew hard that afternoon, bringing with it the scent of the sea mixed with the heavy aroma of wet earth. The sky, previously cloudy, had transformed into a heavy grey blanket, and the rain began as a whisper before becoming a steady patter on the roof of the Whitmore mansion. Inside, the air was filled with the crack of thunder and the sudden flash of lightning, which pierced through the cracks in the closed windows. Sarah was in the kitchen, helping Aunt Ruth sort the sacks of flour for the next morning's batch, when the housekeeper, Mrs. Parker, hurried in, holding up her skirts to keep them from getting wet on the damp floor. The storm had barred several upstairs windows, and some lamps had gone out, plunging entire rooms into darkness. She ordered Sarah to the west wing to fetch candles and oil for the candlesticks, as the kitchen supply was nearly exhausted. The task didn't seem complicated, but with the hasty orders and confusing instructions, Sarah ended up venturing down a path she wasn't used to. Balancing a candelabra with a weak, flickering flame, she crossed the pantry, climbed the service stairs, and entered a narrow hallway rarely used by servants. The walls were cold, and the silence contrasted with the usual hubbub of the kitchen. The chandelier cast long shadows that shifted with each step. The dim light barely revealed the ancient dust-covered frames that adorned the hallway, portraits of Whitmore ancestors that seemed to watch her with hard eyes. With each creak of the ancient wood, Sarah felt the weight of the stories she'd heard, not legends, but silent warnings about places one shouldn't be. Rain battered the high windows, and a bolt of lightning illuminated the end of the hallway for a moment, revealing a half-open door. It wasn't the candle closet she was looking for, nor the oil pantry. The doorframe was wide, made of dark wood, and the lock looked sturdy unlike the house's usual doors. The chandelier's flame flickered as she approached, as if the air itself were denser there. Sarah glanced over her shoulder, making sure no one was following her. Her heart raced, not only from the fear of being off her authorized route, but from the strangeness of finding a door open in this part of the house, especially during a storm. The wind howled outside, and the muffled sound of something or someone moving behind the opening made her entire body stiffen. There, with the flickering light reflecting off the metal of the doorknob and the rain beating down outside, Sarah realized that, instead of just completing a simple task, she was about to cross the threshold into something that would completely change her stay in that house. If this part already caught your attention, leave your like now, so I know you're feeling the tension along with me. The half-open door gave way with a slight creak, revealing a spacious space, yet one filled with a thick, almost palpable silence. The scent of antique wood and aged books hung in the air. In the back, beside a large window with heavy curtains, stood William Whitmore, the 28-year-old heir. He wore an impeccably tailored waistcoat over his linen shirt, the fabric draped well over his erect torso. His posture was that of one bred to command, but his body rested in a fine wood wheelchair with large polished wheels, a stark contrast between authority and immobility. His eyes, a deep grey, met hers in a moment that seemed to last longer than it should. There was no coldness, but a cautious curiosity. Sarah, still holding the chandelier, felt a tightness in her chest. It wasn't fear, it was surprise. What she'd been told about the forbidden room had never mentioned a man inside, much less an heir. William broke the silence first, his voice deep but controlled. "Who are you?" Sarah, hesitating for a moment, kept her gaze down, as she had been taught, but answered clearly. "Sarah Johnson, sir. I'm working in the kitchen. I came to get candles, and I got lost." A brief silence followed, and she felt the weight of his assessment. Then, something unexpected. His tone softened. "And you're not afraid to be here?" She looked up, just enough to meet his gaze. "Scared? No, sir. I just didn't want to cause any inconvenience." That answer, spoken simply, seemed to strike him strangely. There was no indifference in the way she looked at him, nor the pity-filled compassion he knew so well. She saw him as a man, not a burden. The moment was interrupted by a clap of thunder that shook the windows. Sarah apologized and stepped back, but before she could leave, she heard, "Sarah, come back sometime," and she returned. Days later, under the pretext of cleaning baseboards and rarely touched windows, she reappeared in the same room. Their conversations, initially brief and restrained, began to gain momentum. He told her about the horse riding accident at age 17, the abrupt fall from a life of training and inheritances to a confinement imposed by his own father, who had declared him useless for the title. She listened in silence, absorbing the mixture of wounded pride and resignation in his words. Over time, William noticed something in Sarah he hadn't expected: genuine attentiveness, intelligent questions, and quick thinking. Discovering she couldn't read well, he offered to teach her. At first, she stumbled over her words, but he read along, patiently correcting her. Old letters, pages from novels, newspaper excerpts, everything became learning material. Those hours together forged a silent complicity. Between pauses, glances lingered longer than necessary. Small laughs broke the rigidity of the atmosphere, and each page turned seemed to bring them closer to something neither dared name, but which insinuated itself there, in the space between his hand holding the book and hers, still smelling of soap and firewood, resting too close to be coincidence. "Do you think Sarah is in danger in this room? Right danger or safe?" It didn't take long for Lady Margaret Whitmore to notice the change. Sarah, previously completely invisible in the choreography of service, had begun to appear where she wasn't called. A cloth too carefully wiped on the doorknob in the east wing, a tray left millimeter by millimeter on the doorframe, seconds late on routes that had always been timed. The matriarch had trained her, eyes to see what others couldn't. She silenced bells, changed servant rounds, stationed a footman at the foot of the service stairs, and for 2 days roamed the house like someone inspecting a chessboard. At nightfall, she hid behind a column and saw the slave stepped through the beam of light, touched the dark wood, and disappeared through the forbidden door. Lady Margaret's blood boiled. She thought of flogging, of turning the kitchen into a showpiece, but she held back her outburst. Public. Punishment attracts eyes. Eyes asked questions. What she needed was to erase the cause, not the effect. He would sell the girl far away, where neither wind nor letter would bring news. In the morning, he summoned Overseer Jonas and Foreman Caleb to the terrace. His voice was low and sharp. Tomorrow before sunrise, take Sarah to the Market Street market. Mr. Barrow will arrange a buyer in the islands, or if necessary, in New Orleans. No return, no notes, no messages. The men nodded, hats in hand. The agreement echoed on the balcony like a sentence. William learned of the sale by accident. The window was ajar, the previous day's storm still spreading puddles across the courtyard, and two men were talking by the flower bed. The mistress wants the girl far away, will leave at dawn. The words rose like barbs to the bedroom in the east wing. The air felt his stomach tighten. He rang the bell, called the servant. Nothing. Within minutes he heard the calculated creak of the large key and the shuffle of the heavy dress. His mother entered, her face composed. He didn't wait for the formalities. "Don't do this." William's voice, which had so often sounded docile, came firm. "Don't sell Sarah." Lady Margaret placed her gloves precisely on the table. "Don't speak about matters of service. She's not a matter, she's a person." The silence between them cracked. "You don't understand what I preserve here," his mother retorted icily. "I understand enough to know that your decision robs me of the only thread of humanity I have left in this house." It was the first direct affront. Her gaze hardened. Not only would she keep the blindfold on, she would double her surveillance. She turned the key from the outside, the metal latch cut through the air, and left him there, crippled, trapped, his entire body filled with a uselessness he hated to feel. Before dawn, Sarah was dragged from the kitchen with a sharp, "Let's go," her hands tied with a rough cord to prevent falls. As Jonas explained, the world smelled of dew and wet leather. They passed the shed when a shadow appeared between barrels and harnesses. Thomas, William's loyal servant, the same man who pushed the chair on the quietest mornings. She carried a bundle of cloth and a flash of urgency in her eyes. The housekeeper ordered the lamp in the cart changed. She improvised loudly so the overseer could hear. The wick, by chance, broke. The oil leaked, and the torch died in smoke. In the moment of confusion, Thomas cut the cord with the blade of his own keychain, led Sarah behind the corral, placed her in the cart with dirty clothes, and covered her with wet sheets that reeked of soap and rain. Jonas cursed, ran to the shed, argued with the coachman. When he returned, the laundry cart was already turning the inside corner toward the service stairs. No one pays attention to baskets of linen at dawn. Thomas knew every crack. He entered through the back door, climbed 2 narrow flights, avoided the creaky floorboards, and stopped in front of the east wing bedroom. He pulled a copy of the key from his pocket, molded weeks earlier, silently, while he polished the original. He turned. On the other side, William waited, his heart in his throat. He didn't ask how. He simply pulled the laundry cart, helped Sarah to her feet, and led her, with precise steps, to the adjoining dressing room. Heavy curtains, high screens, a deep closet large enough for a huddled body. Thomas left a water bottle, wrapped bread, and a blanket. William looked at the door and at his wife, who was trembling, not with fear, but with disbelief. "For a few days," he whispered, his hand firm on the doorknob. "No one will find her here." He had decided the unthinkable, to hide Sarah in the one place her mother would never suspect her own room. "Would you have the courage to risk everything to save someone? Comment with a heart emoji to let me know you're here with me." It took Lady Margaret only a moment to comprehend the scene before her. She slammed the door open and found Sarah frightened in the corner of the room, and William, in his wheelchair, interposing himself between his mother and the slave. The matriarch's face was a mask of fury, her eyes flashing like blades. "Get out of the way, William." Her voice was low but laced with venom. "That insolent girl will learn what it means to cross my line." She took 2 steps toward the wall where the whip rested, her hands already clasped around the wooden handle, when William, with a quick movement from his chair, placed himself directly in front of Sarah. Even seated, his body leaning forward, he looked like a wall of determination. "You will not touch her." The silence that followed was more deafening than any scream. Lady Margaret took a deep breath, anger building like a storm about to break. "Then I'll call your father," she said, and left with her dress rustling without closing the door. A few minutes later, Duke Whitmore entered the room. His presence was imposing, broad-shouldered, and the bearing of a man accustomed to command and be obeyed. "Hand it over, William." The tone wasn't one of request, it was one of order. William lifted his chin, his gaze steady. "No." The Duke took a step closer. "Are you challenging me in front of a slave?" "She's not a slave. She's the woman I love." The statement dropped like a stone into the mansion's silent lake. Lady Margaret gasped, shocked by the affront. The Duke for a moment seemed in disbelief, but William continued, "If you insist, I will renounce the title." The words echoed through the halls. In less than a week, word spread through the drawing rooms and tea tables of Charleston's elite. The Whitmore heir was in love with a slave and willing to give up everything for her. Old friendships dissolved like sugar in water. Dinner invitations were withdrawn. Men with whom the Duke had business dealings broke contracts, and promising lands were sold at pittances to cover mounting debts. The social pressure was unbearable. The family was being treated like a walking curse. Unsure how to preserve his name or fortune, the Duke gathered his wife in private and announced his drastic decision. William would be sent abroad, away from the city's gaze. A few weeks later, in a remote village, William began living a life he had never imagined. He took up a position as a philosophy teacher at the small local school, captivating young and old with ideas about freedom, ethics, and human dignity. At his side, Sarah not only continued to learn, but also became a teacher for other liberated black women, teaching them to read and write. Afternoons were filled with the sound of voices spelling out new words, and the small room they shared was filled with worn books and fresh dreams. There were no more luxurious salons, no inherited lands, but there was, for the first time, a true sense of peace. And if you were in William's place, would you have the courage to face your own family and the whole society for love? Sarah treated him as if her every gesture were worthy of royalty, not out of obligation, but out of genuine love. She cared for William with a tenderness that went far beyond the physical. It was in the small details, like adjusting the blanket over his legs on cold nights, preparing his tea exactly how he liked it, or sitting beside him to listen silently as he spoke about philosophy, that he felt the depth of her affection. At her side, William experienced a silent transformation. He stopped seeing himself as the paralyzed heir and began to feel like the luckiest man in the world, even when sidelong glances or veiled comments lingered in the air. At first, the small town watched with a mixture of curiosity and disdain, a former aristocrat and a black woman together, defying all the conventions of the slave-owning South. But William didn't care. He learned that other people's opinions carried little weight compared to the peace he felt every time Sarah smiled at him. Their love grew like a solid tree, rooted in complicity and watered by mutual respect. Over time, and now married, they decided the best way to give back all they had achieved was to open a school. The small wooden building with wide windows and a chalkboard in the center became a refuge for black children and adults who until then had never held a pencil. Sarah, with infinite patience, taught the first letters, while William spoke about critical thinking, freedom, and human dignity. Many of those who entered, initially insecure and skeptical, left weeks later with their eyes shining upon being able to read a full sentence. Their story quickly transcended the confines of the community. It was no longer told as the tragedy of an heir who lost everything, but as the legend of the man who found freedom in love. They became a symbol of courage and a new kind of nobility, based not on titles or property, but on the ability to build a better future for themselves and others. William never heard from his parents again. He wrote letters, always respectful, telling them about the school, the students, and his life with Sarah. None of them were answered. Over time, he realized the bridge had been burned, and although this realization was painful, the lack of response only reinforced his resolve to move on. With Sarah, he built a family marked by affection and true partnership. They had children who grew up learning the value of education and grandchildren who listened to their grandparents' story as if listening to a precious tale passed down through the generations. At night, when the school was silent and candles illuminated the simple house, William looked at Sarah and realized that nothing he had lost compared to what he had gained. She smiled at him with the same brightness she had when they first met, and he knew, without needing to say it, that he had found his true inheritance, a life lived with love, dignity, and purpose.